for the BRICS Summit 2023 in Johannesburg this month.
These countries came together, I think, as a result of the challenges they were getting with the existing economic arrangements.
The significance of the gathering has reverberated far beyond the host nation, with over 14 African countries expressing keen interest in joining this prestigious bloc. The emergence of BRICS in 2001 provided an alternative for nations who felt marginalized within those established frameworks.
You will find that China emerged as an economic powerhouse in the last 20-30 years, but they are not part of the mainstream multilateral institutions like World Trade Center and others.
BRICS, essentially an economic alliance, coalesces the strength of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. Shedding light on the essence of BRICS, Professor Waswa Balunywa, a distinguished economic scholar, explains that its fundamental objective is to confer economic independence upon its member states.
India also, as a powerful economic country, is not on the table, you know, for the developed countries when you look at it, and same as Brazil. So these countries came together in a sense to try and work together to see how best they can get into the world economic affairs in a fair manner.
South Africa, the host nation of this year's BRICS Summit, anticipates a cascade of opportunities.
South Africa, with its resources, has potential to be one of the most powerful countries. And indeed it is on the African continent. You know, it's the most powerful country. It's very developed. The only problem is the underclass of blacks. So when it joins these other countries that are developed but marginalized in the Western countries, then they see themselves as we shall have a position in the emerging world trade system.
The forthcoming summit aims to foster growth, development and collaboration on the African continent as nations come together to chart a contingent and united course.
You could say they are more or less developed countries that felt they did not have the rightful position in the G7, in the G20, in the multilateral institutions like World Bank and others.
Beyond its economic aspirations, BRICS recognizes the paramount importance of security in our rapidly evolving world. The summit will address matters of security, thereby highlighting the bloc's commitment to global stability and cooperation.
And it is developing its own technology. It's developing an army. So the next biggest threat America has is China. Russia is very advanced technologically, very, very advanced. So if Russia and China can agree.
Perspective from Professor Balunywa there, and let's get into our story here. You can be part of the show. Go to our YouTube channel, let us know what you think, but also you can get to our Twitter handle, #UBC Behind the Headlines, or you can text us or WhatsApp us on 0709 60 25 92 there. We'll look at three areas: what its effect will be on the globe, what its effect will be on Africa, and largely what its effect will be on Uganda. The biggest story that is in there is that the discussion will be on a new currency. What will that currency be? Gentlemen and lady, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for coming through, old man of the clan. And it's a pleasure to also have Dr. Ramadan here. The first time I am hosting him. But let me start with the old man of the clan. Andrew, you and I were chatting before even the show began about BRICS. Your overview thought on this and why it is becoming center stage right now?
I think that we are living through, I think, the most important phase of global politics. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States emerged as the only superpower in the world. In international relations, it is called the unipolar moment. The world at that time had been, we had bipolarity. There are two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. Now it was only the United States. What has emerged is that China has, defying all expectations, grown its economy rapidly. In purchasing power terms, it overtook the US economy, I think, in 2014. Now it's GDP, again in purchasing power terms, I think, which is the most important currency you can calculate. perhaps to explain to listeners, the purchasing power parity model looks, if you are measuring global power, you look at the size of an economy and the ability of that economy to field a powerful military, because military power is what gives you decisive influence in international relations. So you can ask yourself how many ships, sailors, tanks, artilleries, whatever it is that you consider vital for warfare, a country can buy, and the amount of money it has to pay in its own currency. That is really purchasing power parity. The basket of goods and services nominal money can purchase. If I have $100 in Uganda, you have $100 in New York, we really don't have the same amount of money. $100 in Uganda can buy much more than what it can buy in New York. So that's why purchasing power parity is a better measure of the strength of an economy, or the purchasing power of an economy, compared to nominal values. Because when they say nominal GDP, it refers to the face of the dollar. Purchasing power refers to the basket of goods and services that nominal dollar can purchase. So China overtook the United States in 2014. Now it's about 20% or 25% larger than the US economy. But remember that the existing global system, whether it is the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, all these institutions were created by the United States after World War II, and they were designed really to create what you'd call a liberal international order. The other countries of the BRICS that are emerging, India is emerging as a very powerful economy, and you will see it has overtaken China in terms of being the largest country with the largest population in the world. It may, in the next 50, 60 years, overtake China, if you look at so many other projections, as the world's largest economy. Then you have Brazil, it's a major powerhouse. You have,
I think China would take USA.
I think that India, it's projected, you never know, it's very difficult to predict the future, but by around about 2070 or 2090, it may be the largest economy in the world. Because China has problems, serious demographic problems, because the One China policy. By 2035, about 30% of the population will be above 65. By 2075, a significant share of the population will be aged. There will be people who are retired, and very few people will be entering the workplace. But India is still producing a lot of babies, and therefore it will retain demographic vitality. But the point I was saying is that therefore the unipolar moment has ended, and the end of the unipolar moment meant that since the existing international institutions that govern global affairs were created by the United States really to pursue what you'd call liberal hegemony, many of these countries feel they do not have much space to express themselves through these institutions. They don't have much power. So they have been creating alternative institutions through which they can exercise power and influence on the international scene outside of the Western institutions, IMF, World Bank, United Nations, WTO, blah, 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 blah. That is really the essence of BRICS. And of course, in doing that, we are seeing that many people are talking of the emergence of an alternative to the dollar as a global currency. I personally believe that we are going to see a slow decline of the dollar as a global currency and the evolution of maybe a basket of currencies which will act as the global reserve currency. I don't think one currency will emerge to replace the dollar. Maybe 2 or 3 or 4 currencies will emerge to replace the dollar. That is one. And we are seeing it with the war in Ukraine. The United States has, and her Western allies have sought to isolate Russia. But what has happened actually, essentially the Western world has isolated itself, because other than the Western countries, other countries of the world have not isolated Russia. They have continued to trade with it. They have not imposed an embargo, showing that there is a relative decline in the relative power of the United States and her Western allies. In 1950, the United States produced 50% of global GDP, in 1950. Today, in the purchasing power terms, it produces about 24%. Rather, in nominal terms, it produces 24% of global GDP. In purchasing power terms, it produces about 16% of global GDP. So how much you produce to the global economy and how much military muscle you have really determines your relative influence and power. And I think that BRICS is a representation of the relative decline of the United States as a global superpower.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me bring in...
I'm using the word relative decline, not absolute decline, relative decline.
Let me come to Dr. Ramadan. Both as the person at the steering wheel of this economy and different reforms are there. When you look at this BRICS and look at the summit that is coming, top of the agenda is the currency, all these semantics that have been said. What are your thoughts on it in terms of economy? But also a report that I saw that says reserves in dollars have reduced from 73% to 58% currently. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. Thank you, Timothy, and all of these panelists whom I know, a couple of them, and very glad to meet the professor for my first time. I used to be in these chairs more frequently about 2 years ago, and it's always good to be back. I would prefer that I start, because the job I do these days is to preside over also an economy which might not be under BRICS, but maybe to update you on the state in which this economy is. I should say that the fundamentals look very good for us as Uganda as of now. We have, I should say confidently, arrested the inflation, and we are talking of inflation now back to our target rate
5%.
of 5%. That's our the target of Uganda, of headline inflation, as well as core. But our inflation last month reduced to 3.9%. It's among the few now inflation rates in the region and beyond that have declined back to the target. Many countries are struggling to do that.
What would you attribute that to?
We attribute it to both, first of all, it's not good luck. It's well-coordinated policy. The fiscal and monetary policies, we have coordinated them well with our colleagues at the central bank in the last couple of years, and we have seen results coming out of that. But also, because much of this inflation was caused by factors beyond our control at the beginning, some of them, of those factors, have since been, I think, getting back to the equilibrium. When you look at the food prices, which had partly caused this as a result of bad weather, in terms of a prolonged drought, we have since seen rains come, and you know, once Uganda has food, we are halfway solving most of our economic challenges. Then we have seen also the other contagion or exogenous shocks a bit seeding our ground when you look at the prices of petroleum products, when you look at also even the price of international money and so on. Of course, there are still some risks on the horizon, especially with Europe, the Euro area, and America still struggling with this inflation. We are still importing some inflation, but I should say that the macroeconomic policy regime that we took on has helped to manage those exogenuses also. Of course, you look at also the value of the shilling. The shilling is relatively stable, has been relatively stable, and in recent actually months it has shown signs of appreciation. In Uganda, we don't want the shilling to depreciate, but also we don't want it to appreciate so strongly. It's a bit of a controversy for non-economists. But when it over-appreciates, it will make our exports expensive, and we don't want to see that because they are still low-value exports, most of them. But again, out of policy. I remember the conversation we used to have with our multilateral partners about a year and a half ago when we were looking at the possibility of intervening in the market to ensure that we buy more dollars and so on, to accelerate the reaccumulation of the reserves, and we're saying no, let's leave the market. Let's mainly look at now our industrial policy, how to export more and also how to replace the imports. And then also leave the liberal, flexible environment work. And I think there are signs that we shall get there. And maybe finally, when you look at interest rates, they're also relatively stable, because as government we took a deliberate policy to be very careful with the domestic market of money. I remember about a year ago, around this time, Q1, everybody was angry in town, including some of the panelists, sending me a few messages. We had some conversations on why maybe we are not releasing more money. And our viewers, to release money, you must have it. And to have it in Uganda, you must top up the revenue by going strong on the domestic market to pick that money. We didn't. We pick money from the domestic market for 2 quarters, consecutive quarters. That's half a year. We only picked redemptions mainly. I remember the net domestic finance was about 480 billion alone, just about 480 billion for half a year. And this helped the domestic market to stabilize. And when you see the way we supported the yield curve, we have reaped some results out of that over the recent past. So far I should say we are very optimistic about where the trajectory is showing us, where we are going. But of course we have some risks which we must mitigate. And some of them now bring me into the topic of BRICS. This, of course, is, as Andrew has said, and you said in the preamble, it's a very good alternative for especially us, the Global South, to see that they are 2 of the biggest countries in the world, together with some other emerging economies, coming together. I think officially in 2001, although 2009 they had made arrangements, but 2001 there, that's when said no, because that's when China also fully opened up, and not fully but largely opened up. And since then we have seen tremendous expansion of these economies. They are coming together, and the kind of dynamics they bring on board, they kind of give countries alternatives, especially us who are still small economies, but quite ambitious and also confident of what we want and what we are doing, thanks to the kind of leadership we've been having. So they give us an alternative in terms of fallback positions. You have seen what China, for example, has done in Africa for the last 2 decades, especially in bridging our infrastructure gap. These conversations we are having today, many people take them for granted, but they couldn't be discussed about 2 decades ago, even a decade ago. You had to listen to certain narratives. Gone are the days when every country in the South were being told that the only way to do proper policy making is by only emphasizing social spending. Now we have alternative conversations on the need to balance. For example, expenditure in areas like security, expenditure in areas like infrastructure, as also very important bricks to having a nation state and economy that works for the kind of polity that the Bretton Woods institutions and other partners of ours whom we have been working with for decades and decades have been telling us. So I should maybe leave it at that for now, because I wanted to bring this context in terms of also what we are doing.
And I'm glad you spoke about the economy and also piggybacked back to the BRICS. We'll be back to discuss some of those things, especially on the reserves. But Dr. Muhumuza, let me come to you. Especially looking at the strategy that has been employed on the 5 strategies by the BRICS there, and looking at this summit happening next month, do we see a reset of the global monetary policy? What do we see there, especially affecting Africa and these 5 countries there? Also 20 countries in waiting.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, and thank you, ST, for the context of the economy, because you want to look at the BRICS disrupting. I don't want to say you are getting into a new order. It will be a different one from the old one, but it's a transition, so you don't know where eventually does it settle. Do you see the dollar go away and which currency comes in? The dollar, of course, will remain playing a role, but other currencies may emerge, either whether to challenge it or not. We may still end up quoting in dollars, because like we know now, Russia is not allowed to sell its oil beyond $60 by the agreement that the Western powers put on it. Now, the people buying the Russian oil are not even paying in dollars, but the dollar is being used as a reference point. So we are going to see a lot of that. We buy our things from Kenya and Uganda, but quite always for purposes of reference, again, we use the dollar. So the dollar may remain for some time as a reference point, though not necessarily as the currency in which people will pay. Now, that also is coming in at the time when we have now digital currencies. These days you can use a digital currency. Mobile money, really, what shilling, what currency are you using? It's a reference point. So we might see a lot of transactions moving in without necessarily based on the dollar movements, but on a concoction of other currencies, but the real movement happening in different arenas. So it's going to be a little bit dicey, but certainly different from what we have been what has been happening. Now, the thing you want to be looking at is what is the BRICS about? One of these is we're at a situation where unilateralism had come back. People no longer wanting to engage in multilateral trade. You want to decide who you trade with and who you should not trade with. And I think this is where one of the challenges America has put itself under is imposing sanctions on countries because it controlled their reserves. So if America says, I don't want to trade with Iran, now anybody trading with Iran becomes an enemy. And then they will garnish your reserves, which are certainly sitting in an account in New York. Now many countries are beginning to say that kind of bullying is not acceptable. So they are moving their monies out of the US to have their monies in spaces where they think you're not going to be easily bothered. You know that for you to be able to continue to trade with whoever you want to trade with, picking up your advantages. So we will see that the BRICS are trying to champion multilateral trade. As PSST has mentioned, neoliberal. You want to still retain liberalism in the trade spaces without fear and favor being dictated by certain other political rather than trade and economic principles. That's partly what the BRICS wants to put out there. Now, to engage that, and benefit from these setups. Whether you're a member of the BRIC, like the 20 who are waiting, and of course I can see how they are picking them. You gave a good preamble. This is 40%, 25% of geographical space, 40% of the global economy. Now when they add on these 20, it's going to become that big. But how do you benefit as a country in that space? Which is the conversation ST has raised. The route in terms of trade, besides the military and other political connotations, is the exchange rate. And the exchange rate is going to remain for some time. We're still going to be using the dollar. There are other currencies you can use. As I've said, you may convert into them. So what is the power of your currency as you go to engage the global partners? That's going to be very critical. And he has raised a very important thing, that in the 90s, Uganda was struggling to say, I don't want a very strong shilling, because a strong shilling is going to undermine my strategy of what was called at the time the non-traditional export crops, because we knew our traditional exports were coffee, cotton, tea, tobacco, those kinds of things. Fish and beans were not in there. Flowers were not in there. And so the government wanted to diversify the sources of exports. But you did not want a very strong shilling, because a strong shilling would undermine that long-term strategy. To the extent that Uganda was even rejecting some free money. Donors were giving us money at the time to really put into our health sector. And we would say if the dollars come in from out, they are going to make the shilling very strong and undermine our long-term progression of promoting our flowers and our fish. And I can give a simple example. When I look at the exchange rate, the mid-rate really, because you have the selling and the buying. Others are buying dollars, others are selling them at different rates. The mid-rate as of end of, if you look at the end of July, 1st of August 2022, that's just about a year ago, the mid-rate was 3,860. Now you look at the 31st of July this year, just 1 year later, you're talking of 3,615. There is a difference of about 245 shillings. So the shilling has become that strong. Now if anybody was exporting $10 million worth of goods last year, compared to the same amount this year, that person is losing 2.4 billion shillings because of that strength of the shilling. So if I am an exporter, what incentive do I have to continue producing? Because just within 1 year, you're losing almost 2.5 billion shillings, just because the exchange rate has moved. That's the point he's raising on how do you keep competitive in this space, the new space that is coming up. So we shouldn't only be watching whether we are a member or not. How are we set up as a country to engage that space that the BRICS are going to define? What should be the appropriate exchange rate for Ugandan exporters and for Ugandan importers? That's the dicey thing the macro and fiscal policy fellows have to work out. Now in the 90s, we never created as a country, when I say we were talking about as a country, we did not create an agricultural credit facility like we have in Bank of Uganda. Instead, what they put there was an agricultural policy secretariat to calculate these things. Because remember, the non-traditional exports were mainly from the agricultural sector. So the central bank was interested in a policy environment that supports the private sector in agriculture to propel itself rather than giving it handouts. Now you can imagine if somebody is losing off 2.4 billion shillings of exports, that person didn't need a bank loan if the exchange rate of today was still where it was last year. So do you give him credit? Do you give him a policy environment that allows him to actually survive and transact in an emerging global environment? Okay. So for me, there are a lot more things that we need to engage as we watch South Africa, whether we are in or out. What is that going to mean to us as a country, and how are we going to engage the new order for purposes of survival and progression?
And let me come to Honorable Mara. Andrew, keep a thought with Saudi Arabia. I'll come back to Saudi Arabia because I'm interested in you putting perspective to that. Honorable Mara, you tickled us last week, especially in this area of the BRICS, and the dethroning of the dollar, last week as we spoke about it. But when you look at what Dr. Muhumuza and Dr. Ramadan have spoken about, valuation is still done in dollars. Even when you're buying things from Kenya, the valuation is still going to be done in dollars. The emergency of these currencies we're talking about that might come tomorrow or the day after, what are your thoughts especially on BRICS? And is it advantageous to Africa and Uganda especially, or we're selling ourselves short?
Yeah, thank you, Timothy, and I want to appreciate the panelists for the various insights they provided on the subject. I just want to add by saying that why BRICS this time? As Ramadan has said, effectively started in 2001, and South Africa joined in 2010. But the perspective Andrew gave actually provides the basis on which the BRICS has been created. Post Second World War, the US came up as the superpower in the game. And then the Bretton Woods institutions were created, World Bank, IFM, ID, and so forth. And the basis for their creation was to provide, an institution that will stabilize and rehabilitate the global economy, and also provide controlled exchange rate, which Dr. Muhumuza has talked about. But all these things are happening under one item called the US dollar. Became an international foreign currency for settlements of trade among nations. So many countries just joined and said, we are going to, in terms of global transactions and trade, we are going to settle all these matters using US dollar as a medium of exchange. That gave the United States so much power and control over the global economy. And in effect, the US reserve, Central Reserves, basically controls the global, even other central bank reserves, because all of them are dollarized. Now, that would not have been a problem in itself, but the US started using that to play and extend global reach in terms of power and politics. That is why when, for example, Russia invaded Ukraine, and America has invaded very many countries across the world, the first action was, we are going to freeze all your dollar reserves anywhere in the US. And they took quite substantial amount of the Russian reserves. And then, of course, then embargoes and so forth. And then the secondly also is, in terms of the economy, they were the biggest and the largest economy. But over time, in the last 60 to 80 years, countries like China, which was nothing, Russia, India, were basically not as big as the US. If you look at the US economy now, GDP is about $25 trillion. Now, China is catching up, is 19 trillion. And that is why when you add the total GDP of the BRICS, it's come to over $26 trillion, which is actually bigger than the United States. EU is around 15, 16 trillion. Now, so in terms of the economy, these guys started looking at themselves and said, look, we are big in terms of the size of our economy. If anything goes in terms of geopolitics, if something goes, any fire breaks up anywhere, the US begins to use the dollarization, that strength of the dollar, to undermine global politics. Then they started thinking, why don't we have an alternative? And so the invasion of Ukraine actually accelerated the thinking around what the BRICS were created to do, and many other countries started joining. You actually, Dr. Muhumuza said 20 of them are lining up, including Iran, Indonesia, Malaysia, big countries. If you add their GDP, it will actually grow up substantially. So, are they looking for an alternative currency? The answer is yes, but not in the immediate term. In the medium term, these countries want to use their own currencies to do settlements. For example, in Africa now we have the Afrexim, and President Ruto was saying that Afrexim has come up in a way where we can trade between ourselves, and then they'll find a mechanism of settling the transactions. Personally, I would propose that we actually start using gold as a unit of exchange. And in Uganda here, we produce a lot of gold. We are now melting and purifying gold. Why don't we now have gold reserves at the central bank? We have gold reserves at the Afrexim. As long as now we have got a unit of account in gold, then we can trade among ourselves, and we settle this thing or using gold as a unit of exchange among nations. That is one. So in immediate term, they will try to do settlements within countries using local currency. But China, as we are speaking now, prefers yuan as an alternative currency. But of course, as we have mentioned, US dollar still controls about 60% in settling international trade. So you can't ignore it. So as an immediate solution, it's not going to be a new currency, it will be a multi-currency systems, bringing yuan, bringing South African rand. I don't know which shillings can be done here, but Africa needs to come up with a common currency and a common settlement so that you get rid of the exchange rate between countries like Africa. Then now we are made only to deal with Russia and China and the Eastern Bloc.
But how will you value that currency?
Now, that is a metric. That is why the bankers and economists should put their heads. That's why, for me, I'm preferring, first of all, in the medium, immediately, we can start using gold as a unit of exchange. If we have a central bank, like, for example, if you look at I was looking at the numbers about the African Development Bank in terms of the assets. The assets are very low because we are actually undermining these institutions that we are creating. Even the AU does not have powers. So if we are serious as Africa and we have created African Development Bank, then we really need to find a mechanism under which we can have settlements at that bank, whether it is an African Central Bank. I don't know what we can do, but we either immediately we can create a common currency for Africa, or we use a unit of gold. And so if I trade with you, then the gold will move in my favor at a central point, and we will trade. It doesn't matter whether I have shillings here, you have, don't know, whatever, cedis the other side. As long as we have a unit of exchange that brings all of us together, that would be a substantial amount of which we can use. But I think most importantly also, if you look at these Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and World Bank, the World Bank is basically in the main owned by the US. And they have used that basically to drive their international political agenda. The IMF, you know, we use quotas. We pay money to IMF using special drawing rights. Now, like in our case, we have been pumping in money there. So when in a crisis, my good friend Ramadan would go and get our money back. Do you know where those dollars are seated? Are seated in New York. And it is providing liquidity to the US. Our own money, they are very clever. So you take your money, all of us, about 190 countries, we take our dollars to the US reserves. And then when there is a crisis, then they said, Ramadan, your money is here, you can come for it. You come and take it, borrow it, but make sure you bring it back. So we're basically they're collecting all these monies across the world and putting it to increase their reserves, strengthening their economy. That is our money, but is in another location. So BRICS is saying, why then don't we, if we have an alternative currency or an alternative global financial institution, which can mirror World Bank, which can mirror IMF in the emerging economies, in these emerging economies. We can have one. For example, the headquarters of BRICS is now in Shanghai in China. And they are creating a development bank there, which is actually, they have capitalized at about $50 billion. And they are beginning to create some form of bank in China now. So if all of us can come together and say, okay, let's mirror something against World Bank, which has policies that are more comfortable, that we can leverage. So to answer your question, how would this be able to help us? I think let's have an alternative financial institution that is created by us, that doesn't have an imperialistic tendency, which lacks elements of subjugation, and saying, no, I tell you what to do. If you listen to what Ramadan said, is, the language they're speaking now is different from 10 years ago. 10 years ago, they just call you and say, you remember when Professor Suruma came here, they only were looking for $100 million. They were told, bring UCB in, sell that bank for you to get $100. Then they said, how can we go back to the president without this money? So they put the UCB in the kitty, and the bank is gone. So, but if you have another alternative bank that does not have that kind of mentality, all of us will be able to have access to it and get that money without conditionalities, because it's happening among brothers. So I think we need to have this alternative to avoid a global domination, and for the world to have freedom in terms of trade, and also have a multi-currency that can provide flexibility in terms of trade. What about if I don't have US dollars?
Okay.
Yes.
Honorable Mara, let me bring in Professor. Professor, looking at China willing to attack Taiwan, already Ukraine and Russia at loggerheads, China and India having border issues, this looks like quicksand of the BRICS already. When you look at it, what is the narrative that they're standing on? What's their foundation there that will keep them running to have these emerging economies?
Yes, thank you very much, Timothy, and good evening, viewers. I think the principles that bring them together are more than, I know there have been so many articles on how the BRICS will not be sustainable because China is in competition with India, China is attacking Taiwan, or then South Africa has racism. So I think we are being too quick to highlight why BRICS will not work. And I think we need to pay attention to why did the BRICS get together. The previous panelists have raised all that. What I can just add is how I think the world was also fed up of where one country mismanages an economy and the whole world collapses, especially the 2008-2009 issue with the Lehman Brothers and whatever happened in the US, which is actually one of the triggers of strengthening the BRICS, that one economy mismanaged its affairs, but the whole world collapsed with it. And I know I told people I did economics until senior 6. So the little things we used to study there and study about the BOP balances and the things like that, where I would be told, their quotas, however much coffee and tea you produce, there's only an X amount they can buy, because we were all seeking to sell to a particular block. I think the BRICS, as everyone has said, is providing an alternative. Those issues are there, but those issues are also in the countries that have formed the old trading blocs. So if you're talking about racism in South Africa, we have racism in the US. So it's not immune to that, but it has not been challenged in belonging to where it belongs. So there have been issues. So I don't see it as any worry. I think let us focus on what the BRICS gets onto the table. Members here have already highlighted the issue of more infrastructure development, more foreign direct investment, more markets for our things, and more importantly, we need to appreciate that failed economies produce failed states. We are now having an issue in West Africa, and today there was a statement made by the new president of Burkina Faso, who said we have been supported by France for 63 years, and we are not any better. So let us cut links and maybe get a new person. Probably that new person will take us to the promised land. Not directly like that, I'm paraphrasing. So failed economies produce failed states. What happened when initially we were all under the World Bank system? Then because of some reasons of mismanagement, we all went under the neoliberal system. We all went under structural adjustment systems. So that actually made the governments of the countries that fell under that regime look like, one, they didn't love their people, look like they had no capacity to plan, look like a bunch of fools. And many of the problems we are having today are because of that order. Because these people here talk big economics, which is okay. The person on the ground is saying, I voted Honorable Mara, I want a bridge, I want a hospital. That's our understanding of the state. But if your country is also under a trade regime where they are being dictated to, you cannot do this because they must be seen to play to certain terms internationally, regardless of what it means to the people. And we know with the neoliberal system, what actually that meant is the state retreated from many sectors, but also it made life harder for the day-to-day people in terms of social investments, in terms of actually poverty increased in many countries than it had been before. So if the BRICS come up and say, for us, we are going to come up with a new development bank with different terms from the World Bank, I think for me that is a more important thing to focus on than to focus on China has gone to Taiwan and China and India rivaling, and then Brazil is too far from Africa. Because those things, there's an international system that can moderate. If we think there's a country overstepping the bounds, there are mechanisms to that. And I think that debate should not distract us from what actually the BRICS have to offer. People have talked about 20 countries joining. I'm happy that 3 of those are African countries, Algeria, Egypt, and Ethiopia. We are going to learn from them. Maybe out of them we can also learn something. We are happy to have these eminent panelists who are talking about how they are trying to fix our economy. And actually, we don't have that information outside there, because for us, the day-to-day, we just know things are not working. But it's good to know that inflation is being controlled, and that a few days ago it was 3.2. So that means in the world, there are alternatives, but they have not had the opportunity to rise. So if in this new arrangement, they have an alternative to rise, and we know that they are there, it's very important for building confidence, it's very important for identity, but most importantly, beyond the economics, there's an angle that the BRICS came with, which does not seem to come up very much. And this was the institutional framework of dealing with the problems without passports. Climate change, insecurity, and all those problems, the voice from the global south. I think whatever is happening, as long as they are raising that alternative voice from the global south, they are trying to amplify the problems that the global south is faced with. I think for me that is an alternative. So to raise that international trade is not fair, there's no trade justice, there's no economic justice in the global economic order. I think that is very important, other than in the past where we were told their basic principles. All you needed is do things right. And indeed we followed that theory properly, but things didn't turn out the way they were turning up where they were coming. So let's try another alternative. And for me, I believe there's great hope. There are great opportunities. Of course, we have to position ourselves strategically. I'm not an economist. The economists will do that. But we have to position ourselves strategically. We should be asking, why is Egypt in? Why aren't we in? When might we go in? But maybe it can also be a trigger for us to think about the other trade blocks we belong to, like COMESA, like others. So the point for me I'm saying is beyond economics, there are social dividends to a strong economy. There are political dividends that come from a strong economy. I think let's give it a chance.
And a follow-up question for you, Professor. Looking at this, the traditional order and the US, what do you expect them to respond? How do you expect them to respond, especially to this now that is becoming a narrative, a new force, especially taking a new wave?
Well, I don't think they're going to take it lightly. They're not going to take it lightly because they have built this kind of infrastructure for years. And it's not, for them it has been transaction, it has not been charity. So they are losing ground. So I don't think they are going to take it lightly, but we are watching to see what the reaction will be. Because the BRICS have also not come up as a bunch of jokers. First of all, we must say globally, people have been raising this debate about the bully boy tactics of the US, the unilateral sanctions against people and things like that. So this has been a narrative, but I think people have been saying it in isolated terms. The economics, the social justice, the politics, the militarism, the securitization of everything. So people have been raising this debate in different fora, but as individual countries. We tried different blocks, but maybe the small blocks were blocks of equally poor people who were dependent. And we were all, of course, in dollar-denominated debt, so that created problems. Then we devalued, then we lost it even more. But I think now the BRICS have come together as powerful blocks. You've heard from the previous panelists, Russia is very advanced in technology and in military hardware. China is not a joke. Recently, actually, they have launched some of the biggest ships in terms of trading and the biggest submarines. India is also coming up. You've seen them going into space and whatever else. South Africa also on the continent is not a joke. So they will try to respond, but I think they're going to do more negotiation than trying to take people on, because this bloc is equally a powerful bloc.
Thank you. Andrew, let me come to you. Nixon, 1974, signed this agreement with the then king of Saudi Arabia. We also see the military, American military leaving Saudi Arabia. We see Russia signing an agreement with them. What role is Saudi Arabia playing in this area, especially already seemingly trading in domestic currencies there?
Well, I think, let me put it in the context of global power. Just imagine you are the most dominant power on the world scene called the United States. What would be the most important areas for you that you need to focus on? If you look on the map of the world, the first region would be Asia, because the largest number of human beings, the largest economies of the world are stationed there. A significant share of the world economy is produced in Asia. So that would be your first area of interest as a global power, because if you are locked out of Asia as the United States, and therefore you cannot trade there, you cannot invest there, you cannot have a financial stake there, you'll be locked out of a highly dynamic and rapidly transforming economy. So you must be a player in Asia. The second area, of course, would be Europe, and Europe is a very rich continent as well. The third would be the Middle East. Why? Because they control about 40 to 50% of the global oil reserves. If anyone took control of the oil reserves of the Middle East, they would have powerful implications on global energy prices. So that's how Saudi Arabia becomes an important player in global economics and global politics, in the sense that if Saudi Arabia has a significant share of total oil output, if it wasn't in the market, it would create huge instability in global energy markets. And I don't think the United States, Saudi Arabia is distancing itself from the United States. I can say that it is diversifying its reliance from America. Previously, it really depended on America almost 90% for its domestic security, for its economic survival. Now, China has emerged as a major player. Russia is an important partner with Saudi Arabia, because I think today the United States is the largest producer of oil, Russia is the second largest, Saudi Arabia is the third largest producer of oil. So, but America is not a big exporter of oil, because a lot of the oil they produce, they also consume it. So Russia's relationship with Saudi Arabia is they need to cooperate in order to control the price of oil. If the two of them enter what we call a red ocean strategy of competition, they can drive oil prices in the world so down to their mutual detriment. But I just want to come to this issue of global politics. You see, I don't think that BRICS in and of itself is the alternative to the United States. I think that the alternative to the United States is China. China's economy has grown so big, and as I've said earlier, it has overtaken the United States economy in purchasing power parity by a factor of 25%. I think the United States GDP is 25 trillion. China's GDP in purchasing power parity is about 32 trillion or 31 trillion. So that's a significant number. And therefore, we need to look not so much at BRICS, but at China. If China continues to grow at the current, even at 5%, as the economies of countries grow, their interests change. For example, China is the world's largest manufacturer. So China has to move around the world to scavenging for raw materials to feed her factories at home. At the same time, it must travel the whole world to deliver manufactured products to markets. Am I correct? So if you have to buy so many raw materials across the world, you must exercise influence in those areas where you're buying these raw materials. Assuming somebody has more influence in those areas than you, and they come and said, we are blocking you from purchasing these raw materials, then you can't feed your industries. And equally, then you cannot have those industries feed the international market with goods. So if China continues to grow the way it is doing, I think there is going to, already we're seeing it anyway. What we're seeing is very ferocious strategic competition between the United States and China for power, for influence in different areas. The areas where China is going to collect these raw materials, it's not entering a vacuum. There are also countries that have influence there. So China is competing for influence and for power in these regions. As it competes, a cooperation between the United States and China is going to be difficult to sustain. Extreme rivalry with the risk of military conflict is going to be very difficult to avoid. And I don't think it is possible for the United States and China to exist without very serious bordering even on coming violent rivalry. For the simple reason that the history of the world shows you that it has never happened that two most powerful nations in the global system live at peace with each other. Look at the ancient world. You've heard of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, Rome and Carthage, the United States and the USSR, Britain and Germany. Whenever you have had two powerful states in the international system, they have either had to go to war, or they have had high levels of rivalry because they will compete for power, they will compete for influence. And I think that is where we need to look at what will be the effect on global politics of the competition or the rivalry between the United States and China. I'll give you another example. If you are China and you have to go all over the world collecting raw materials and move all around the world distributing your manufactured products, you have to use sea lanes. Who controls the world's sea lanes? It's the United States Navy. Assuming the United States decided that not to allow you to use the international waters, then they can blockade you. So if you are China, you are compelled to build a very powerful navy to ensure that you can be able to protect your ships, to go around the world collecting all these raw materials for your industries and also delivering these manufactured products. The question is, if China begins building a navy to rival that of the United States, I think right now China has more ships than the United States, by the way, in terms of the navy. How will the United States respond? Will the United States think this is a benign response? For you as China, you may not have any plan to attack America. Your aim is to ensure that you have the safety of your trade routes, and that's your aim. But America may look at it as an attempt to kick them off the international waters. And that's another area of rivalry we're going to see. I do not know whether you have witnessed that the United States has stopped herself and her allies from selling high-value, highly sophisticated microchips to China. Have you guys noticed that? Because it is a policy of the United States to contain the growth of China. They must not have access to highly advanced microchips and semiconductors, because that is what is making China a technological giant. Remember that you compete in three areas. First, you compete in the economy, but you also compete in technology. Who is the most advanced in AI, in telecommunication technologies like 5G, Huawei versus whatever the United States is doing? China is beating America in that, in AI, in robotics. Who is the best there? So, because all these technologies also give you different capabilities, military capabilities. They give you both economic advantage and military advantage. So, more than the BRICS, I think that the biggest issue happening in the international scene is a relationship between China and the United States. If you have noticed, China has been creating actual institutions to rival, or for that matter, supplant World Bank and IMF. I think they have created something Infrastructure Development Bank. They have created a bank to deal with infrastructure. The Road and Belt Initiative, the Belt and whatever initiative, is an attempt to create alternative sea routes for China's trade away from the United States. And as China, of course, by the way, I should tell you, one of the problems of BRICS is China and India. As India grows, it becomes also a rival to China. Because India and China share a border and they have disputes along that border. So they have structural tensions between them. And China has been trying to court Pakistan, which is a historical enemy of India. And why is Pakistan important for China? Because China needs access to the Indian Ocean. So it needs to use Pakistan. I do not know whether you know that China has built ports in Sri Lanka, because that is it's, I think, interest is in future to have where its navy ships can rest and perhaps launch war. China and Russia share a common border. They used to have about 93 border disputes, which have been reduced to about 6. But one of the reasons I wonder why I find American leaders difficult to understand, in the sense that Russia is not a peer competitor of the United States. China is. If I was an American policymaker, if I was Biden, it's in my interest that in the coming rivalry between China and the United States, which is inevitable, or the existing rivalry between China and the United States, on whose side do I want Russia to be? I want Russia to be on my side. If I was the United States, I would be quoting Russia and India. But so this BRICS alliance, I get the sense that itself, in the long term, the conflict between, if the United States played its cards well and allied and tried to bring Russia on its side, it has a better ground to ally with Russia than Russia can with China, because of the structural conflict between China and Russia. And of course, the United States has an advantage over China to win over India on its side. Essentially, India should be with the United States in order to limit the capacity of China to gain or exercise hegemony in Asia.
You're already poking holes in the BRICS, but as you
Timothy, I just want to pick up from Andrew. I have an alternative view, a different view, that BRICS will work. And this is why. The India and China are looking at where they would sell their goods. They are looking for market. Everybody is looking for market. And it is very difficult to start a global war in circumstances where we are now talking about globalization. No country can actually survive without the other. Even United States cannot survive without China, because most of the sales they are making goes to China. And the same thing is true with China to the US and also to Africa. So if you look at the population now, and I think this is one element we need to look at, is the population. Both China and India, they have over 1.4 billion people now. Africa is the third, about 1.3 billion. So everybody's looking at where do we trade? And also why China will not create any kind of enmity with India is, if you look at the total GDP, which we have already discussed, about $26 trillion, far above that of US. And if you get the new entrants, which is coming in, so in terms of the global market, the size of what would eventually become BRICS would be such a humongous trade area that it would be actually foolishness for somebody to really meddle with it.
Okay.
So my view is that because of the size of the population within BRICS, the fast growth we are experiencing now in those economies, by the way, the population of the US is only about 338 million people, and their growth now is about 0.38%, while in Africa, the growth of population is 4%. So
Okay.
Africa is accelerating in terms of growth. So in the new market and in the new world order, which we are looking at, Africa and the East will be the biggest area that we must be looking at.
Okay, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be discussing with the doctors, both Dr. Ramadan and Dr. Muhumuza, to understand the economics and also the framework that needs to be in place, especially now that we look like a small piece in this global village. This and more after this break.
It's super fast internet. Well, it's a super camera. It's a super battery.
Phone battery full.
Yeah, it's a super deal. Get the Kabode Super from MTN now at a reduced initial deposit of only 49,000 shillings and pay the balance in Pola for as low as 833 shillings per day. Grab this Super Kabode deal this Christmas and get 2 GB of free MTN data every month for 8 months. Get the Kabode Super now from any MTN shop countrywide. everywhere you go. MTN, regulated by UCC.
Juko.
Yo.
Check the shopping, man. What's your secret?
Haven't you heard of the Parish Development Model, PDM?
Yes, I did, but I thought it was just a talk.
No, Sebatia. It is real. I and a few friends together formed a circle, accessed money from the PDM, invested in a portrait project, and now things are moving.
Juko. I thought I was one of your friends.
You are.
But you left me behind.
I didn't leave you in poverty. What you do, just visit your LC2 chairperson and your parish chief and start the process of economic transformation. Just like that. The Parish Development Model is an initiative from the government of Uganda through the Ministry of Local Government designed to transform all lives of Ugandans for the better. PDM, my parish, my development, my life.
Introducing the Infinix Note 30 series in partnership with Airtel Uganda, a smartphone where style meets functionality. Take charge of the day with special features like the 108MP triple camera and 68 watts first charge, and the best part is you can use this phone to charge other phones. You also will enjoy free 3GB from Airtel every month for 3 months on each new device purchased. Dial *100#, select data and devices to get your free data. The Infinix Note 30 series Spark, a connection in partnership with Airtel, a reason to imagine.
The Presidential CEO Forum, together with the Office of the Prime Minister and Captains of Industry in the Private Sector, in collaboration with the Science, Technology and Innovation Secretariat, National Planning Authority and Kira Motors Corporation, will convene the 4th Biennial Private Sector CEO Retreat from August 2nd to 3rd, 2023 at the Kira Vehicle Plant in Jinja City under the theme Uganda's Industrialization Agenda, positioning Uganda as a net source of e-mobility solutions in Africa, hosted by His Excellency the President of the Republic of Uganda, General Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. The 4th CEO's Retreat will explore how to deepen value addition in Uganda's industry and build a sustainable and integrated e-mobility ecosystem in order to maximize the potential for development with substantial economic benefits, including wealth and job creation. To participate, please contact the Presidential CEO Forum Secretariat on 0393 249 530 and via email info@pcf.go.ug.
And in talking news, MTN has improved on their data voice bundles. You can now call across all networks for the same price. We've talked to several eyewitnesses on the ground, and this is what one of them had to say. Amos, did you hear about the MTN daily voice bundles? So, to join many more other Ugandans enjoying these MTN daily voice bundles, dial *100 *21# or use the My MTN app to start enjoying. Stay tuned for more offers from MTN.
Welcome back from that quick commercial break here on Behind the Headlines. My name is Timothy Nyangweso. In the studio, I'm joined by Professor Sarah, Honorable Mara, Andrew Mwenda, Dr. Muhumza, and Dr. Ramadan Ngobi there. So let's get to the discussion of BRICS here and bring it closer to home on what the economics looks like, especially as us, Uganda and Africa. Where do we leverage? How do we benefit? Let's get to that. Dr. Ramadan, let me come to you. Looking at especially the multi-currencies that might be involved in this, looking at gold reserves, as Honorable Mara mentioned there. We also see countries like China and Brazil agreeing to trade in their local currencies. We see India buying oil in rupees. We see France and China also paying in yuan. When you see all these currencies, and especially anyone who wants to leave the country, wants to buy something, it's basically the dollar. What frameworks do we have in place, especially with us joining this global village, to be able to manage expectations? You spoke of the shilling, not appreciating too high, not going too low. What infrastructure is there for us to manage expectations and appetite?
Thank you. what a relief to, you know, be sometimes in this environment again. And I was about to lend my time to Professor Sali there. And because I was enjoying the music, and then the gentleman interrupted. So it's okay. First of all, Timothy, I think Africa now is the greatest opportunity for geoeconomics and geopolitics for both the G7 as well as the BRICS. But it appears to me that perhaps the BRICS are considering us as more of an opportunity compared perhaps with our erstwhile kind of partners in the G7. Because number one, you need to realize that Africa, let alone Uganda, Africa is the oldest continent, but also now the youngest in the world. And there are so many opportunities that come with that. And it seems to me that the BRICS, in particular China and India, and lately I think Russia, because of perhaps their own geopolitical dynamics, they seem to be taking more focus and advantage of us. And when you look at the areas they are emphasizing, they are areas which suit us quite much more. As I started in the preamble, the infrastructure, investment in infrastructure, investment now in a industrialization drive in Africa, but also not forgetting what we bring on the table as a continent by reciprocating that with the huge consumption for these products, fast-moving goods manufactured in Asia, both East and Southern Asia. And therefore, when you link that into now the dynamics in the way we manage our economics, our what you may want to call geoeconomics, the frameworks that these countries in Africa are working on to manage our macroeconomics, let alone the microeconomics. We are looking at how to change the structures of our economies. We are no longer pursuing growth as an end in itself. We are looking at partners that are ready to work with us to industrialize this continent, build modern economies, economies that can create productive jobs, economies that can produce the goods in volumes, but also affordable products for our populations. Economies that are no longer just looking at those few variables that we used to emphasize. So we wouldn't want to anymore pursue, for example, jobless growth or unequal growth, or looking at just investing in a primary education without skilling. and so on and so forth. You can name them. Whatever I'm saying here is on our development plan, for example, of this country. So who fits more in our template as a partner to Africa is the question we need to pose and answer to ourselves, and it doesn't require genius to really know, perhaps between the G7 and the BRICS, who has positioned themselves much, better than the other. So these frameworks that we are now using, will it be fiscal frameworks, the industrial policy frameworks, foreign direct investment, kind of platforms that we may want to use. Recently, our president was in the Eastern Europe, looking not for aid, not for conversations about how to get support in any other way other than trade, other than productive kind of partners who are ready to invest in productive sectors, in industry, in manufacturing, in adding value to our raw materials. I know these are conversations we've had for many years, but now you see a number of partners who are really erecting themselves to come and say, look, we can be available to partake in mutually beneficial relationships, respectful relationships, and having conversations that are going to feed into our medium-term as well as long-term goals in Africa here. So therefore, when you talk of let it be currencies, reserves, and the kind of frameworks we are going to use, you are not reinventing the wheel. You are not actually asking rocket science kind of economics. We are talking of basic, simple economics of how best can we, as Africa, work with others, and in this case, especially those economies which have transformed at the back of Africa, because Africa provided resources in most of these transformations which have taken place in Europe, and then later in the North America. We are now looking at serious partners in development, good development financing. That is patient, but also that is serious enough to not to be conditioned on quite very interesting prerequisites. And
like the World Bank. And
those are your words. But me, I'm talking about the bigger picture we are looking at. What I heard you talking as the bigger picture. How do we therefore work with these serious partners? I think this is what Africa is looking for. I've had a number of heads of state in Africa very eloquently putting across our demand as a continent for serious partnerships, serious engagements, and the bottom line is Africa now is the main opportunity for anyone who would want really to engage in serious partnerships for development.
Dr. Ramadan, just a follow-up question. The World Bank seemingly pull the rug off under our feet, then when do we join BRICS? Since you're the only person we have here who could easily give us an answer in that direction. Because if it has been pulled from us, we need financing, we need partners that fit within our template. When do we get in?
No, we're engaging all our partners. You see, Uganda has always been a very patient nation, respectful, but also very good at engagement. We are among a few countries, and our leader has put it very clearly that does not easily fall for, you know, I'm pro this or pro that, I'm against this or the other one. Whoever fits in our ultimate goal is a great partner. And in this case, as you know, the World Bank is one of our long time and very, very important partners that we've worked with since it was created and Uganda became independent. We've been working very closely together, and we shall definitely continue to engage. If there are any issues that require engagement, and we've been engaging, and we're engaging at the very highest levels, we shall be able to resolve them. That does not mean that we are going to choose between this or the other, against the other. No. We are, remember, we are in Africa with a culture of even polygamy. It doesn't matter how many partners we have, for as long as we are having the results that we need. In this case, the results we need, everybody knows them. We need development in Uganda. We need now serious partners in development. And with the development, we are talking of structural change. We need to see these words which we say, they are not just words. Socio-economic transformation. It means that our society should move from where we are or we've been for many years as just people who are interested in growing food, and we eat and we go to sleep, wait to die. No, we would want now to have an economy that has capacity to produce most of those sophisticated goods that we call sophisticated manufactures that we've been importing for many years. Like the president is telling us these days, if we can't go to the moon, at least let us be able to produce a few automobiles to move around the earth. And proudly say, okay, at least we achieved that when we rest, but not to just be there that for us our main comparative advantage is producing potatoes and that's all. No. So in that, therefore, if it is the World Bank that's working with us to invest in a modern agricultural practices, in a infrastructure, in a smart technologies, ICT and so on. We have big projects we are implementing together. We shall be able to do that. If the BRICS come in and they are providing us with more money to invest in infrastructure, investors are coming to set up here from India, from China, from Russia, to be able to produce from here the goods that we used to import. We shall work with all of them.
Thank you, Dr. Ramadan. Dr. Mumza, coming to you, with all these things of emerging currencies, what are your concerns about them, and what is the projection of what the global market would look like and the balance in the economy?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Timothy. I think as indicated the thing that is changing in terms of currencies is if you are not going to use the dollar, then who are you trading with? Because what if they say we can transact in our own currencies? So what is the strength of your own currency vis-a-vis those you are going to be trading with? And I think that's where the point comes in, as Andrew rightly put it. You don't want to look at this as BRICS versus the US. That's a conversation that is being led by China and the US. The US must first of all retain its constituents of the G7, and China is trying to build another constituency. Now there is a space that will be very hard for the US to pick. So China has already grabbed off those. South Africa, I want to grab Brazil, I want to go with Russia. Now can I add on more? But we also know the G7 also was trying to expand to a G21 plus and all sorts of things. So there is a space out there that these two need to see on their side. And so it is that space in there that you want to say where the conversations are going on. Where and how should Uganda position itself? You're like a small tiny speck, but you're part of that collection of stars in the sky. You can also be seen from wherever you are, whether you are shadowing. So it's going to be really a space of how do we fit into the emerging conversations, and what are we taking to that global market as a country. That's a conversation we need to have internally here. What do I want to be promoting? The opportunity is really coming through. As has been mentioned, America is denying China the microchips, saying you're not going to have this technology. But then all of a sudden America realizes China controls 80 to 90% of rare earth metals that are needed to produce the microchips. So now the two are locked up. That's why you saw big powers from the US going to China to begin a negotiation to say, no, we can't resolve this by fighting each other. We need each other. But now how do you evolve that new space? Now, here comes in Uganda. We are all saying here gold is going to take a new center stage. Because in the areas of uncertainty, you don't know what the value of the dollar will be.
Yeah.
But it is very clear what the value of gold is going to be.
Yeah.
Now, everybody is buying gold. The price of gold presently is so high. So you want to say, as I bring in investors as a country in Uganda, we're having a conversation in Munyonyo on coffee. I'm like, you guys, we have gold. Why should the conversation not be on gold? Because remember, you are a small country with poor people. You want to see how did the Asian countries leap. And when we were in Jinja last week, presidential CEO forum, the president re-echoed what Honorable Musenero had mentioned, the leap. Uganda cannot grow gradually, as PSST has mentioned, by growing potatoes and then processing your coffee here. And you need something that propels you to leap above the massive population pressures you are getting, the current debt pressures you are already having, which are dragging you really, that every time you want to move, that historical debt is on you. You are keeping on rolling it in front. You want to put it behind you. So what should define Uganda's great leap? And what are the opportunities I see here? So I would want a conversation on how do we get our gold from the ground. Gold is right now our biggest foreign exchange earner. 40 to 45% of our export is gold. It was literally nothing 10 years ago. So it has already shown you its potential, that while you have been on oil and gas for the last 20 years, you're still on that conversation. Gold can really be that great leap. In 2 years, 3 years, you could have reached a level of exporting up to $5 billion. Now, the one we still have is largely transit gold. But we have our own gold here. So I want to hear conversation like we've had conversations on getting oil out of the ground. How do we get our own gold from the ground? The people I talk to in the gold sector will tell you these are artisanal miners, the 5-10%. Gold sits a kilometer underground. Artisanal miners will dig. The moment the pit is about 15 meters, they run short of oxygen. they come out. When you hear a mine has collapsed, they are trying to get people out from 2 kilometers. That is where the gold actually sits. That's where the minerals sit. So when are we going to set up an equivalent or something like a mining company? We need to expedite that. Find these new partners in the new conversation at the global level. So is it going to be the Chinese? Within the BRICS conversation, is it going to be the West? I want to get that gold and the rare earth metals out of the ground, so that now you begin to raise your hand, or even before you raise it, people will see you from afar to say, why do we quarrel with China on rare earth metals? Who else has them? Now, this new emerging conversation in Africa, coups, wars, it's back to who controls the minerals. Who should control the minerals, especially as the new global order is emerging. Now, Uganda, as the PSST has rightly put it, is going to be geopolitics, geoeconomics, and diplomacy. How ready are we in those conversations? While you want to do your physical infrastructure, you want to educate your people, the new global space that will give you what we would call in the military air cover, where your infantry children go to school, you inject people here, you deploy some agricultural and whatever roads and rails here. You need that air cover at this international level, which is your geopolitics. How are you managing it? How you are managing your geoeconomics to tap into these global powers and become an export-led economy. You tap these global big markets where within a year you are able to sell. You're talking about India. India's export is $700 billion. One of those $1 billion is from Uganda. So it might be tiny, but they're exporting to us goods worth $1 billion. It's just about a small percentage, 1.4, less than 1.4%, less than 1% literally of their total exports. But they will not ignore Uganda when they sit to have a conversation on where do we export. So Uganda should now be sitting and say, which 5 products or 3 do I want to export and to who? Now that begins to talk of which currency conversation therefore do I need. Is it South Africa where I'm going to sell these? So even if the dollar is not there, me and South Africa will find a currency that we can use as long as my trade continues. So I would want to hear these conversations moving on or moving forward. I want to see a fusion, and the PSST is here. The Minister of Finance taking that center stage of the planning. Uganda will still have a problem of sectors planning and all sorts of people planning. You need to come back and centralize that to say, guys, I'm the one in charge of the economy here. We are going to go minerals. And when we go minerals, this is what I'm looking for. Now everybody wants a tax exemption. How is he supposed to finance the development you're benefiting from? You want a small place here, you want a small, Mr. President, give us an exemption, give us an exemption. You're not going to walk into the new world order when behind the scenes you are fragile. That for me is the story behind the headlines. Why the headline is BRICS, what is the story behind this new reconfiguration? How are we preparing ourselves? Because that reconfiguration is going to come. Should it leave us like 60 years ago? That we are not going to change, even the new order will leave us as we have been. We are not going to present the same old products. I saw people saying we are going to revive the railway. No, I mean the railway to Kasese was about copper. Now we are reviving the same railway. It's about what? I want to hear that story. Is it again cobalt? Is it copper? Is it cows? Shouldn't I be thinking of a railway to somewhere else?
South Sudan.
I mean, you want to rethink. Don't just bring history as it was.
Yeah.
It's nice to revive the railway, but to where and to what end? That conversation is still having a lot of question marks. And until we close it, the new world order will come and leave us in the old order, and then we'll move on, still remaining as what we are.
And staying with you, Dr. Mumza, some of the things that you read about the BRICS, especially when they talk about fiber cable failing there, they also tried a few things that failed. The only thing that seems to be succeeding as of 2024 is the new development bank. But you talked about debt, our debt as a country. And one of the things they were saying in this new order of the development bank is that they will accept any country regardless of whether it has debt with the Western or any other financial institution, either the IMF or the World Bank. What do you think especially getting into this BRICS, how do we negotiate our debt? How do we come out of it? Because you say we take 2 steps forward and we seem to be taking 5 steps behind, especially with the role of debt. How do we position ourselves to clear this debt and move forward in development?
Really a very interesting question that Uganda would want to put in the brief of whosoever is going to be involved in these discussions, wherever they are going to be, because debt is right now quite a big problem to us. And the bulk of it is you are really restructuring, refinancing as we call it. So what conversation do I want to have with who to put this debt behind me? Now, luckily enough, the biggest pain of our debt is coming from these members of the BRICS. Not necessarily the World Bank and the IMF. It's countries like China where you want to go and have a conversation. We have already ever received debt forgiveness from World Bank, IMF, and African Development Bank, group of the parish donor clubs. And China is reluctant to renegotiate the debts now. That's where the poor countries of Africa, or the indebted countries of Africa, want to say, BRICS, this is one of the things we want you to resolve for us. Our debt is strangling us that we can't even rise up to join you and move with you. So help us to reconcile and resolve the debt issue. That's one of the things that we want to put there. But to resolve that, as I've said, you have other minerals or items or commodities that can give you a great leap. You want to bring them on the table. And the reconfiguration that is happening in the New World Order gives us that advantage. As we've said, in the 50s, copper was the mineral to have. So these guys did a rail line all the way from Mombasa to the foot of the Rwenzori mountain to get copper. Today it is gold. Now, gold will not need a rail line because of its value and the nature of gold. But it's going to need you to go deep down to find it, pull it out, refine it, and send it out there. So you want to find which partners will help me leverage my gold, leverage my rare earth metals, as the oil comes on board.
Okay. Professor, coming to you, especially cultural diversity, especially among the different countries there, how do we bridge that gap of diversity so that we have a common interest? And what does Uganda bring to the table?
Wow, that's an interesting question. What does Uganda bring to the table? I think in terms of cultural diversity, each of these countries in the BRICS has had a long history of collaborating with African countries, particularly including Uganda, by the way, for a long period of time, in terms of education scholarships, in terms of university funding, in terms of postgraduate training, in terms of research, in terms of tech transfer. So they have been doing that, but the collaborations have been between individual universities in those countries and individual universities in Uganda. Or they have been with a few individuals with the capacity to go to those countries. But if you look at a country like Russia, Russia had a long history of giving educational aid, giving educational scholarships and capacity building to these countries for a long time. Unfortunately, that's the time where we were hung up with the West. So everything Russian was looked at and devalued. But anyway, today we have a lot of that investment brain-wise into Chira EV, and it's working. So maybe we took long to realize that there's something good can come from there. Our people have been going to China for a long time, our students, in terms of government-to-government collaboration, in terms of research. I mean, scholarships. Same with China. And they have mainly gone in particular areas of advantage. For a long time, India has given scholarships in the areas of business development, in terms of commerce. China, when it started to really give scholarships in terms of oil and gas, in terms of dentistry, they tend to go for the certain kind of sciences. Russia, of course, had a long history of engineering, medicine, and the like. And South Africa, of course, when it came on board, it gave multiple kinds of scholarships. We haven't had much collaboration with Brazil, but Brazil is reaching out to the continent, of course, for influence, but also tracing its argument that it has a very big black population, and therefore it is a natural partner with Africa. So these things have been there, and with them have come a number of institutions like language centers and whatever. So even when you go to these universities, of course now you're going to find Confucius centers with Chinese being taught up to secondary schools. We've had Sanskrit for a long time, but maybe it didn't pick up. But we've had Russian for a long time, and sometime after the Cold War issues, it went down. So I think the cultural issues are not very diverse. And you can see, like when we had the Russian summit 2 weeks ago, in addition to what the politicians were doing, there was what the university people were doing. There were a lot of collaboration between universities. There was a lot of collaboration between small traders and big traders and politicians. So I think that cultural diversity can be bridged. And as we are saying, of course, people are talking about tech transfer. Some of these are some of the things which can be used to leapfrog that. There's a lot of trade, by the way, from our people downtown in Chukuvo with China and with India, to the extent that they now no longer need to, initially they no longer needed to carry cash because they were paying through the Exim Bank. These days they even don't need to go. They have the trade partnerships and people come over. We've had a lot of investment and collaboration in terms of health and the health tourism and that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot taking place. I know the PSST always tells us he's a good promoter of Bubu. And whenever he has come to the university or he has faced the council, he has always given us this example of inspiring younger people to go there and learn and see what are those people doing differently. And if you come back and you can prove that you can do it and it picks up, they are ready to, the ministry is ready to support you through the infrastructure of the central bank and everything. So I think there's a lot that can be bridged. I think what we need to do as a country is to find out what do we want. I think the mistake we made in as African countries for a long time, we were convinced that other people had our best interests at heart. So we entrusted them with determining what we needed as a people. But over the last 30 years, Africa has been clear on trying to assert itself, but it didn't have a framework. So with these other alternatives coming up, you will have the interests like Dr. Mhumuza and others have said, in terms we want natural resource extraction, who can give us the resources to go deep? We want tech transfer. We want energy, like the BRICS summit, which is coming up next week, is really going to talk about things like energy, things like, as I said, problems without passports, epidemics. You saw what COVID did, and we suddenly realized that our friends were not really friends. You talk about things, tech transfer, geopolitics, emerging economies, markets, trade. So these things are going to come up, and these things inevitably shift the cultural diversities and bring people together. Because whether you understand each other, you have to trade, you have to study, you have to do that. So I'm not really worried about the cultural diversity. I mean, when we started with the British, at the time they came here, what commonality did Britain have with Uganda at the time? 1894. Didn't have much, but we bonded. So we shall bond again. Thank you. Yeah.
Let me come to Honorable Mara. Bless you. Last week, you were championing, especially the dethroning of the dollar. And some of the things that have been said, especially with this BRICS summit that is happening, is for countries to be able to have money of the same currency in those countries when they want to trade. But what would be the impact of dethroning this dollar, especially globally and in Uganda?
Timothy, dethroning the dollar won't happen quickly. As I've already mentioned, is that even currently over 60% of the global central banks have US dollars as their foreign currency, reserves. And therefore, it's going to be difficult to dethrone it currently. And as I've already mentioned as well, even BRICS are saying getting a common currency is a long-term strategy. What they are trying to do is to see how best they can do settlements in the respective countries' local currencies. So like you find in some transactions they would pay in rupees, in yuan, in South African rand, in Ugandan shillings. So they're trying to see how best they can use national currencies as settlements, trade between nations. Like Uganda trading with South Africa, they can settle it in their local currencies. So that will happen for quite a while. Meanwhile, US dollar remains supreme in terms of exchange rate. US dollar will still continue to operate. In terms of reserves of most of the central banks will remain US. So it's a long-term strategy, which mid-term to long-term strategy is something which they are pursuing. But nonetheless, if you look at even the idea of creating an alternative global bank to IMF and World Bank, you need to look at the figures. If you look at World Bank and IMF combined, the asset base is over $1.1 trillion. Now, let's look at our African Development Bank. It's on about $15 billion. What about Afrexim? $31 billion. Nothing in trillions or even hundreds of billions of dollars, no. So even the countries, the African countries which are highly indebted, it is now very difficult for even my brother Ramadan to go to African Development Bank and say, give me some money. They might not even have that money available because look at your asset base is small. That's why I'm saying for us who are also pretending to be joining the BRICS as Africa, we have undermined our own institutions which we have created. That's why AU can't function. The African head of states have arrogated themselves the powers. So AU is just a paper tiger outside there. Unlike EU, for example, the way EU is operating, EU has moved forward and they have created euros. And so within the EU, in terms of transactions, they're using euros. In Africa, we have nothing. And in terms of strengthening our own African Development Bank, in real money, it's actually nowhere. So the argument which is coming with these BRICS is that unless the teams that are pulling these things together are willing to pull real money into the new creation, it will be a lot of wishful thinking and nothing to it. Because if you look at World Bank and IMF have said $1.1 trillion. And so which means any crisis anywhere in the globe, they can reach you and say, Ramadan, Uganda is in a crisis. Oh, sorry, here's some $600 million, easily. Now, can African Development Bank do that? Not a chance, maybe. Or Afrexim. So for us to create an alternative currency, it will require commitments of nation states. It will require allowing some centers beyond nation states to have some powers where they can now control inflation, they control exchange rate as a central bank of Africa somewhere. And I don't think it's a very easy thing, it's a complex thing because it means losing power to another higher entity. And so even within BRICS themselves, as much as Russia, for example, now is saying, we are willing to have yuan as an alternative currency because of the strength of the Chinese economy. If you look at also, Ramadan, you look at the GDP of Africa, is less than $3 trillion. In the scheme of things, it's about 2.9 trillion. The whole of Africa. And I would want to agree with you that we need a structural change. The manner in which our economy is structured and is set up, we actually need to modernize. So we need to manufacture. We need to, whatever we are processing here, we should add value to it so that we can actually play big in the global economy and improve on our GDP. In a scheme of things, Africa is one of the largest continents, very rich in minerals, as Dr. Mumuz is saying. Now you just get our nice gold here. It's in transit to Europe, into Americas, and they are the ones who are putting in those gold reserves. I was having a conversation with the deputy governor, and we're saying, in Uganda, for example, why are we not using gold as part of our reserves? We actually can buy gold in local currency and strengthen our our reserves using dollars. So at an appropriate time when Ramadan wants to pay his debt, you can now go into the market, it's dollar to dollar.
Yeah.
There is nothing in between. So you can do settlements quickly. Other than getting this gold, we let them go, somebody keeps it, somebody processes it. And I want to appreciate the president when he said, as long as he's president, no minerals will live in Uganda unprocessed.
Okay. Let me bring in Andrew. Andrew, some of the things that they're talking about, technology, innovation, talking about development, poverty alleviation, they sound very good in books. What comparative advantage do we have as a country? What are we putting there that these people will be listening to us?
I don't know what they mean comparative advantage in terms of the products that we produce and
Yes.
sell. Well, first of all, I believe that we may, right now, I could say that we have comparative advantage in producing maybe raw cotton and raw coffee. But
How can you be so pathetic?
Yes, but I don't think that gives us
It's more than that, Andrew.
Seriously. Because you see, if you look at the original theory of comparative advantage that's generated by David Ricardo, that's what it dealt with. If you have good soils and you can produce coffee so cheaply, you are stupid not to sell coffee. If you have high technology and you can process that coffee,
relative opportunity
that's what you should
cost.
do. That is the traditional theory of comparative advantage in international trade. But of course, as countries started developing, if you look at East Asia, even the late developers of Europe, you realize that the argument is that comparative advantage can be actively constructed. In other words, you may not have the technology today, but you can take a series of policy initiatives that can allow you to enter a particular sector and improve your comparative advantage there. So comparative advantage, the original, or what I would call the traditional theory of comparative advantage, was really a static theory in the sense that it depended on your fact endowments. But now it is something that is dynamic and can be actively through human agency changed. I should tell you that perhaps if you ask me what is the constraint we face in a country like Uganda and these other African countries that are poor, I think we have three constraints. The first constraint is interest. If you're going to develop something, it's not enough to have an aspiration. Aspiration must be backed by capacity. So perhaps you ask yourself, do we have entrepreneurs here in Uganda of the capacity to create these kind of viable businesses that can actually transform our products into industrial goods, these raw products into industrial goods? That's the first question. And my grandson, Ramadan, should address that. If you don't have those entrepreneurs, I see our president running around looking for foreign investors thinking they will develop Uganda. On this, I even disagree with my grandson, Fred Muhumuza. He's also my subject, by the way, as a deputy king of Njorantor.
He's also your grandson.
The two of you are cousins, you didn't know. You're both my grandchildren. But, so, interest. Do you have those entrepreneurs? The second thing, what are the ideas or ideological beliefs that Ugandans have? Especially about the role of the state in stimulating that kind of transformation. If you listen to public debates in Uganda, I don't think that we can tolerate a state that is highly active in trying to support private entrepreneurs to build this capacity. Remember that if you try to invest in these things, it's so difficult. You can't study the case of Toyota in Japan, or Hyundai, Daewoo, Samsung, Kia, whatever it is. Governments had to pump in so many subsidies, give them protections, and at the same time, initially they will produce poor quality products at a very high price. But as they grew, gained more experience, improved their productivity, expanded their scale, they reduced their unit costs, over time they became competitive. I don't think the political and intellectual environment in Uganda would facilitate us supporting industries that are producing poor quality products at a high price, and we tolerate it. I'll give an example, like road construction. Why is our road construction sector dominated by the Chinese? Really, they have capital, they have technology, they have skills, they have organization, they have so much that they have accumulated over time. If a Ugandan company was to compete with them, it can't beat them. So if you want to build your own local construction industries, rather construction companies, initially you may have to tolerate them doing poor quality roads at a higher price, but with better state guidance, they can grow to become very powerful. I don't think our systems, our intellectual environment will facilitate the government doing that. And remember that whenever governments intervene in the economy to choose winners, there will be a lot of corruption in it. Are we willing to tolerate it politically? These are things we should always ask ourselves. So I don't think that...
NEC is doing well.
I don't think that we have the right that these people may be there, but we don't have the institutional framework to maybe look at them. Many times I go to Makerere or Uganda Research Institute, I find young kids from Makerere University and elsewhere doing great innovations.
Yes.
How can those innovations be converted into viable businesses with viable products? Because that requires a linkage between the innovator and capital.
Yeah.
When Google was starting, they went to a venture capitalist who said, okay, I'm giving you a check of $1 million. You have a great idea. Whether it was Facebook or Apple, whatever, there was someone, venture capital. Where is that venture capital here? Maybe it would be organized through the state. It really is the state or the private sector in Uganda willing to fund our own innovations. So I see so many constraints, that these constraints are societal based. And our leaders are also from the same society, and therefore they are constrained by these factors. These structural constraints really, really hold us back.
Thank you, Andrew. Ramadan, let me come to you, and let's look at something that Honorable Mara mentioned there. Especially one of the things that is being discussed come the 22nd and the 24th is reserves being backed by gold. What are your thoughts especially on that? What is the risk in it and what is the benefit if we leave the dollar and put our reserves in gold?
I don't know whether we need to leave the dollar per se. We were there. We had the reserves backed by gold in the past. What did it do? Did it develop the world? I think we don't need to carry out experiments where we have already had results. Of course, I know now we are back into those conversations of stubborn nationalism and a lot of wishes that should be disrupting what is happening now. But I think what is happening just requires some small fixing here and there, not total overhaul. The world is where you lose the tire of a car and you dismantle the car is not a very wise approach to things. I would think that the current system is actually working. It only requires...
Can we do it side by side, together?
Oh yeah, of course countries have started going back a bit, but those are countries that have achieved certain levels of development and they need some comfort. Some are into self-actualization and they say, no, look, what if this guy who's a superpower wakes up and he messes us up and we don't have a fallback? What do we do? But I wouldn't think that this is a foreseeable future. I think in the foreseeable future we are likely to have still the dollar running our reserve system, but definitely some gold standards are coming back. Now we are into also these bitcoins and so on are coming on board, and in some areas now they have gone into these digital reserves and so on. Those experimentations are there, but for full-fledged kind of gold standard and going back to it and keeping also huge humongous reserves in gold, there are countries that have done it, but I'm afraid they are quite few.
And if you talked about the possibility of having both, the diversification of our reserves, either digital currency or the dollar or the gold, what are the benefits and the risks of having that diversification?
But how much reserves are you diversifying? You need also to look at that. That's why I said it has to be after a certain level of development. I've learned 3 major lessons in development. The first one is that everywhere is different, and with that you need to always be careful on what you are doing. Don't just jump on a wagon simply because it is in fashion. You need to first ask what is fundamental in this case. The fundamental issue right now for some economies of our size and the sophistication is, first of all, to expand our GDP, but also ensure that this GDP we're expanding has a certain quality, which means investing more in structural transformation, as I stated. And then, as you accumulate more of these reserves, now you start thinking, how do I diversify them? But it's like asking a guy who hardly can meet their dinner, a bill on how to save. Sometimes I used to tell my students, and they ask me, but dear sir, do you want to save us to save ourselves? Because we have nothing much even to feed ourselves on. So as we work on in Africa here, I would want us to first concentrate on the things that really matter. The simple economics of, first of all, deal with the market failures, but as well ensuring that as you intervene as government, no, you are not omniscient. Also be mindful of government failures. And after that, you facilitated what Andrew was talking about, how really to get this deliberate industrial policy work, the way, for example, those developed nations did. Then with the time, like now, Uganda, if you see where we are, you see, we forget so quickly. If you really look at where we were, not many years ago, 20 years ago, and where we are now, go and check, the numbers are there. How much was Uganda's GDP? How much were our reserves vis-a-vis where we are today? I think another 20 years we should now start these conversations after we've accumulated something on how do we, but you can't diversify nothing.
Thank you very much. Lastly, Dr. Fred, Andrew said something about the entrepreneurs. How does these summits or these relationships translate to an ordinary Ugandan?
I think it's a question of what PSST has raised. Each country has a different context. So if Japan supported the entrepreneurs, Korea supported the entrepreneurs, what conditions did they give them? Which comes back to speak to what type of governance do you have to hold these entities accountable to the common person, but also which enterprises did they support? As I've said, at that point they were looking at exports. Motor vehicles get into the export market. It is out there. So even as I choose who to support, what is the ultimate objective? And my ultimate objective should be rooted on that common Ugandan you have talked about. What are you bringing in for this common Ugandan? Is it a job? Are you stabilizing the exchange rate, as PSST has mentioned? What are you diversifying? The exchange rate reserves that we really keep there for use. You have like money you moved with in your pocket. It is for your lunch, it is for your transport. That's not a reserve. It's money in your pocket, but really. So when you look at Uganda's import bill of $7 billion and our reserves of 3.5, are those reserves? They are really going to be drawn on along the way. But if your import bill gets to $7 billion and you have reserves of 10 million, then you can say, okay, 5, can I convert it into gold to secure the common Ugandan when finally they want to move and do whatever they have to do. So we have to be looking at a common Ugandan from that high level, that the jobs you want to give them are decent jobs, because sometimes we say we have employment. But when you look at what is this person taking home, 400,000, 200,000, is that a job really? So you want to use that as the benchmark. In planning, we say target the worst and make sure that worst is comfortable. Then the Andrew Mwendas are covered in the process. So I think we need to keep that common Ugandan in every decision that we make. Where is the common Ugandan in this conversation of development, in this conversation of the BRICS, the new order? The new order must speak to that person. As I said, I can sell my goat there, I can sell my cassava there, and pick up something for myself.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to give each of you a minute to give us your parting shots. I'll start with the Professor, Honorable Andrew, Dr. Fred, and lastly, the PSST.
Yes, thank you very much, Timothy. I started by saying failed economies produce failed states. What we are witnessing on the African continent is a crisis of having growing populations and elite populations that with no development. It creates disgruntlement, it creates disillusionment, and people think maybe change, even violent change, will bring dividends, only for it to sometimes bring more problems. So mine is to say that the BRICS is an alternative to what we have known before. What we have known before has carried us this far, but not very far. So if the BRICS are coming in now, especially with foreign direct investment, with infrastructure, and to augment what the others had done, and even maybe do it better and on better terms, is to be appreciated, because now the challenge on the continent for every government is how do you sustainably place your graduates, your younger people. We are the youngest population. Every economist must be focusing on that, because after all the jargon and the mathematics has been done, that is where the rubber meets the road.
Okay.
Otherwise, if people suspect that there's iniquity, they will blow up. And when they blow up violently.
Honorable Mara.
My parting shot is that as Uganda and as Africa, we must be ready to play in the global market by building our own economies first, making sure that we are strong at home. As East African community, we have dealt with the structural rigidities. If we can't sell our milk to Kenya, then how can we play in the BRICS? So let's deal with the common issues in Africa. Let's look at strengthening our own African bank, making intra-African trade easy, dealing with the structural issues at home here so that we can manufacture and be able to export something within the BRICS. And if we do such things, we are able to even attract capital, which is more coming from the East. If you see what has happened now with the rumors, I don't know whether it's factual, with World Bank, saying we are not going to give you money on account of you passing a law on homosexuality. But Ramadan, African values are not for sale. If you do, polygamy in the US, they will mock you, they will not accept. But here we are saying, no, we are not, our values are like this. And then somebody said, we are not going to give you money. So this is a good alternative for us as Uganda will have access to another source of capital.
Thank you. Over to you, Andrew.
Well, I personally think that if we have our values that we should own slaves or exterminate Acholis or Watoro, surely I think other countries should respond. So you can have values, but if your values really are inhumane, they are not very good values. The second challenge to what my grandson Mara here is saying.
He's also your grandson.
He's the oldest
man of the clan. How would you forget something
but
like
he hasn't
that?
defined the clan.
The African clan. So the other point is, even if those were values, Uganda actually has a law against homosexuality. So I do not know why they were adding another law, except poke a finger at these Western countries. So I don't understand that. The third is, even if those are our values, I personally think that it's always important to study the assemble of forces. You see, you may have the right cause, but get destroyed defending that right cause. It doesn't make sense. So it is always important to be very strategic in decisions you make. I would have shared Robert Mugabe's view of land redistribution, but you don't get a red flag and wave it in front of a bull, and it kills you. So they wreck your economy. What have you benefited? So I think that the value should not be defended at the price of destroying what it is trying to protect. The most important thing about our countries is how do we protect the integrity of our countries. And the strategies we take may require certain compromises and accommodations. In fact, Uganda government is behaving exactly like the opposition in Uganda. I tell them, Museveni is too powerful. How you approach him, you must consider so many elements. It isn't that you can stand and put your chest there, it may crush you. Right now you can see how he has caused confusion in their ranks and they're eating each other. Obara, in that sense, don't say that your value.
Timothy, we need another debate on
that. Dr. Fred, your parting shot.
Ultimately, you don't want to lose the people whose values you want to protect. So that's the balance. too, as we get into the BRICS, how did these countries get there? We need to diversify. Right now, you see the service sector, and Uganda talks about industrialization, a good thing. But these countries have also picked even much more from the service sector. You see people going to India for medical treatment. The BRICS are already looking at ICT. China, as we have said, is chips, technology, human labor, medical treatment, ICT, banking and insurance. How do we also raise the bar on these? Because this is what made the BRICS get to where they are, that now they can have their bragging rights.
Okay.
Maybe then we'll have enough resources to say these are our values and these are the people we can now talk.
Okay. Finally.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to come back to the national broadcaster.
Come back home.
Come back home.
Yes.
And having these wonderful conversations with these wonderful people. Of course, as Uganda, we are ready to work with every single partner who adds value to our development agenda. And our development journey is clear. We want development partners who are ready to engage in mutually beneficial partnerships in areas of investment, in areas of trade, value addition, but also in areas of providing good development finance to our this now fast growing and sustained economic environment. So with that, I think His Excellency the President has this evening issued a statement to the Bazukulu on how we are going to continue these engagements with our partners and be able to propel Uganda to the levels where I want it to be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We always keep our promises here at the National Broadcaster. Last week, Honorable Mara was celebrating his birthday, and we promised a cake. So we deliver on our promise.
You did.
And we're going to cut the cake and call it an evening. I think the old man of the clan is here.
Yeah.
He said everyone is a grandchild.
Yeah.
The grandchildren will cut with the grandfather. But from us to you, thank you very much. I'm going to ask that the cake is brought. And Honorable Mara, all of us will stand up and help him cut this cake so that we can call it a morning.
Yeah.
How do old men cut cakes? Cakes are for
So you
children.
must remove this thing from
I think we'll all stand up and sing happy birthday to Honorable Mara as he cuts his cake.
Yes, hello.
I'll remove it.
Wow.
So
The guy came prepared in
I will ask all of us to come closer.
I'm here.
Come and we. Yeah.
Okay. I'll ask everyone to hold the knife with him. 56.
5-6.
56.
Yeah.
26. We count
Yeah.
from 3, 2, 1,
Go.
0.
Thank you.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear. Happy birthday to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
UBC
Yes.
for my birthday cake.
From us to you, good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning
So-
on Behind the Headlines.
It's going-
you tired of high fees and slow transfer time when sending money? Airtel Money is here to revolutionize the way you move your money. We have revised our rates Pakaku ground. Sending money from Airtel to other networks in Uganda, East Africa, and to the rest of the world has never been more affordable. Dial *185# and start sending money. Switch to Airtel Money today and experience unbeatable rates and top-notch services for all your local and international money transfer needs. Airtel Money, instant, secure, borderless.
UBC, inspiring Uganda.
Gulu City Market lies in 4 acres of land with a population of about 4,000 registered market vendors who are doing business in this facility. We really appreciate the initiative of the government to come up with this project that is benefiting not only the business community within the market, but the entire community within actually sub-region. When you look at the market previously, the market used to be not like this one. With the market vendors, they used to sell under papyrus reeds. And we used also to ferry our goods, come and sell, then you take it in the stores or elsewhere. But now, due to this infrastructural development, the vendors now, they are able now to sell, cover your goods, leave it there, and you come and get it the next day when it is safe. The safety of our goods and the convenience of doing business has improved greatly. That makes the local community very, very, very happy when they are doing business in the market now. I want to appeal to my fellow vendors and the community, of the entire Chile sub-region, that we need to embrace and support the government so that they continue also bringing us more development in our region.
UBC, inspiring Uganda.